the entire company. Patriot Core Systems, one of the most respected names in American cybersecurity, was crumbling under a threat it couldn't control, and the highest-paid minds in the industry were completely paralyzed. It was real, deadly serious, and it was spreading through federal systems like wildfire. Despite the army of tech geniuses inside the building, not one of them could stop it. In this story, the impossible happens. A 58-year-old cleaning lady, invisible to those in suits, becomes the only one capable of saving America's digital backbone. Yes, you heard that right, the woman scrubbing toilets. Late at night, ends up doing what million-dollar experts couldn't. Before we dive into this powerful and emotional journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing our community. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Inside the marble halls of Patriot Core Systems, a fortress of glass and steel, standing proudly in Arlington, Virginia, a storm was silently brewing. 12 top-tier cybersecurity engineers, recruited from the best universities and with salaries to match their egos, sat inside the crisis room with furrowed brows and caffeine-smeared notebooks. The air reeked of desperation. On every screen, red blinking alerts warned of encrypted systems locked down by a sophisticated ransomware virus. The attack had begun 3 days earlier, slowly escalating from one locked workstation to the paralysis of critical Pentagon-adjacent servers. This wasn't just a corporate issue anymore, it was a national crisis. Richard "Rick" Daner, the 62-year-old CEO and founder of the company, stood at the head of the table, watching his empire tremble. Beneath the surface of corporate arrogance, a former colonel-turned-billionaire tech mogul, Rick had built Patriot Core on the values of discipline, order, and American grit. His piercing blue eyes scanned the chaos with a mix of anger and disbelief. Team was more useless than the last. Protocols were being overwritten, backups compromised, root access stripped. For the first time in his career, Rick felt helpless to the outside world. Everything still appeared polished. Inside, though, the foundation was splitting. Executives barked orders into phones, engineers snapped at each other in frustration, and no one had slept properly in days. Rick knew they couldn't keep this up much longer. If word got out, their credibility with federal clients would be destroyed. The media would have a field day. Line in the damn thing was still spreading. Meanwhile, unnoticed by anyone, Mary Collins moved silently down the corridor. Dressed in her blue janitorial uniform, with a name tag that was partially peeling at the corner, she was invisible by design. No one ever noticed the cleaning crew after 8 p.m., and that was how Mary preferred it. At 58, she had no time for conversation. Her only concern was getting through her shift so she could get home before midnight, check on her sleeping grandson, and pray for another healthy day. Widowhood had hardened her, but not broken her. Tonight, though, something was different. As she passed the executive floor, she heard voices, raised, panicked, sharp. She slowed her pace and noticed that the large wooden doors to the crisis room hadn't closed all the way. Through the narrow gap, she caught a glimpse of whiteboards scribbled with complex sequences, arrows, acronyms. Mary wasn't just a cleaning lady. She had spent over a decade frequenting public libraries after her husband's passing, diving into books about computers, programming, and system architecture. She had no formal degree, but her mind was sharp, and her curiosity had never dulled. She loved logic puzzles, and what she saw on those boards looked exactly like a puzzle. She couldn't explain what drew her in, but something about one set of variables caught her eye. A sequence of authentication protocols, 3 digits, inverted. Her brow furrowed. That wasn't right. In silence, she waited until the room emptied for a short break, then slipped inside. The screens were still on. The code was open. She hesitated, heart pounding. Then, with calm fingers, she typed. It took her less than 5 minutes to reverse the compromised protocol. She knew exactly what was wrong. A recursive error loop caused by a misread authentication hash. The whole system was locking itself out based on a flawed check. She corrected the line of code, ran a silent debug, and saw the system begin to recover, like a dying heart resuscitating. Her hands trembled slightly. No one would believe this. She closed the terminal, erased the activity log, and returned to her cart. She was in the middle of replacing a trash bag in the hallway when Rick Daner walked back toward the crisis room. He had forgotten his leather folder on the table and came back alone to retrieve it. As he entered, he paused. The room felt ... different, quieter. He looked at the screen. No more red alerts. He clicked open a diagnostic. The ransomware attack was reversing. He blinked in disbelief. Through the glass wall, he saw Mary walking away. She hadn't noticed him. He stepped out, called to her. "Hey, you were just in there. What did you do?" Mary turned, slowly, her posture calm. The login loop, the reverse hash, was flipped. That's how they got in. I corrected it. Silence. Rick walked closer. "You're the cleaning lady?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. But I read a lot. The code made sense. I hope I didn't cross a line." Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and went back into the crisis room. He summoned his engineers, ran the diagnostics again, confirmed the change. It was true, the attack had been neutralized. Not by his expensive team, by her, by the woman they all ignored. He returned to the hallway. Mary was still standing there. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Now." And just like that, everything began to shift. Mary sat across from Rick Danner in the executive boardroom, an absurd image, the janitor in a faded uniform against the backdrop of polished oak and glass. The silence between them was thick with unspoken assumptions. Rick had dismissed the engineers, unlocked the door behind him. He was still trying to wrap his head around what had just happened. He'd built an empire by trusting experts, investing in credentials, and believing in a hierarchy that put men like him at the top. But now he was staring at the woman who had done what none of his team could: crack a ransomware attack that had brought federal operations to the brink. He expected nerves from her, hesitation, or even awe. Instead, Mary's expression remained steady, respectful, but unfazed. She didn't speak unless asked. It wasn't pride. It was simply the presence of someone who had spent most of her life unseen and no longer needed recognition to validate her. Rick leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on her. "How long have you known code?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Mary didn't blink. "Since my husband passed, I started reading in the evenings. At first, it was to keep my mind busy, but it made sense to me. Patterns, logic, sequence. I liked how everything had a purpose." Rick nodded slowly. "You never studied formally?" She shook her head. "No time, no money. And I didn't think anyone would care. I just wanted to understand how the world was changing." There was something in her tangential matter of fact that disarmed him more than any bold statement could. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't asking for anything. She had seen a problem and solved it. Simple as that. But it wasn't simple. Not at all. What she had done was technically brilliant and strategically elegant, and that made Rick uncomfortable in a way he couldn't admit, not because he was threatened, but because it made him question how many other voices he had ignored. He cleared his throat and stood. "Come with me," he said. "There's someone I want you to meet." Minutes later, they were in the main operations hub, where the engineers were still trying to reverse engineer the solution she had already implemented. Rick walked to the center and raised his voice. "Stop what you're doing. I want you all to meet Mary Collins. She's the reason this company didn't just go under tonight." The room froze. Some looked at her, confused. Others smirked in disbelief. One even scoffed under his breath. Rick continued. "She found the flaw in your code. She patched it, and she didn't do it for a paycheck. She did it because she saw the truth." The tension was immediate. The CTO, a stiff man named Carl Mendel, approached Rick with visible irritation. "Sir, with all due respect, we don't even know what she did. You can't just bring in someone off the maintenance staff," and Rick cut him off. "She's not maintenance anymore. As of now, she's a technical consultant. Put her on the access list, give her clearance, and yes, she's coming too." The next board meeting. The murmurs turned to chaos. Rick didn't care. He was the founder. His word still meant something. Mary stood silently through it all, eyes scanning the room with calm detachment. She had no illusions about how these men viewed her, but she also didn't need their approval. Her only thought was that if there were more problems like the one she'd solved, someone needed to be watching who actually cared about getting it right, not just getting credit. Later that week, Rick brought Mary to the top floor again, this time to the strategy conference with the board. 12 people in tailored suits, all of them staring at her like a misplaced file. She wore the same uniform. She didn't own anything else. But when she opened her mouth, everything changed. With gentle confidence, she explained how the ransomware had exploited the authentication protocol. She used metaphors, not jargon. Compared the breach to a lock being installed backward. "You all paid attention to the vault," she said, "but no one noticed the keyhole was carved from the wrong side." There was a pause, then someone laughed nervously. Not at her, at the simplicity of the truth. And just like that, the power in the room shifted. From that point on, Mary became a quiet presence in the most important meetings. She didn't speak unless asked. When she did, her words were usually brief, but always hit the core issue. She didn't try to solve everything, just what she understood. Rick watched how she operated and began to realize something deeper. Mary didn't just have technical talents, she had moral clarity. Where his executives schemed and spun data to protect their roles, Mary saw problems and tried to solve them without ego. That integrity began to draw him in. Not romantically yet, but with admiration. And something older than that, trust. The turning point came at a national security symposium, where Rick was expected to present a technical overview of their platform to a panel of federal judges and defense contractors. The script had been rewritten 10 times by consultants. Rick, tired of the jargon, went off book and stumbled. The room grew tense. Then Mary, sitting in the back, stood up. She walked to the front, whispered something in Rick's ear, then turned to the room. "He's trying to say this," she began, "that the system doesn't fight attackers with walls, it fights them with awareness. The platform isn't about shutting people out, it's about knowing who's really inside and why." The applause came slowly at first, then it grew. After the presentation, Patriot Corps landed a $280 million contract with the Department of Defense. Rick didn't even smile. He just turned to Mary and said, "I think I owe you dinner." She smiled softly. "You don't owe me anything, but I'll take a sandwich." From that day forward, things moved faster. Mary's name started showing up in internal reports. She never asked for credit. Rick made sure she got it anyway. But behind closed doors, resentment brewed. Executives whispered. Some framed her rise as an embarrassment to janitor, suddenly holding court with national leaders. Emails circulated, mocking her background. One VP referred to her as the charity case in coveralls. Rick shut it down every time he caught it. But he couldn't stop all of it. He didn't realize how deep the sabotage would go, and Mary, who had spent most of her life surviving storms, began to sense another one coming. Only this time, it wasn't code that needed fixing. It was people. The boardroom was packed, the tension stifling, and Mary stood near the glass wall, as if balancing between two worlds. On one side, the polished executives who couldn't stand her presence. On the other, Rick Danner, who had just dropped a bomb. On the leadership team, Mary would be accompanying him to the government pitch next month, not as a silent observer, but as part of the technical team. Gasps were audible. Carl Mendel, the CTO, looked like he'd swallowed battery acid. "She's not even credentialed," he muttered, arms folded, trying to stare Rick down. "This is a billion-dollar account, and you want to put a janitor in front of federal officers?" Rick's voice was calm, but edged with warning. "She's not a janitor anymore, and she's the reason we're even standing here with this opportunity." Carl wasn't alone. Several board members had already raised concerns privately, worried about optics, media scrutiny, and what they called brand dilution. One had even suggested giving Mary a quiet severance package with an NDA attached. Rick shut it down instantly. He wasn't sure what line had been crossed inside him, but something had shifted. For years, he'd relied on people who told him what he wanted to hear. Mary was the first who told him the truth with no angle, no politics, and that truth had saved them. That mattered more than legacy or image. Mary watched the exchange without flinching. She'd spent most of her life watching powerful men shout over others. She didn't need to join the shouting match. But later that day, as Rick walked her to the elevator, she stopped him with a question that caught him off guard. "You sure about all this?" she asked, her eyes steady. "You're fighting your own people." "Why?" Rick exhaled slowly. "Because they built this company with mirrors and titles. You reminded me what it's supposed to be built on. Results, character." Mary tilted her head. "Don't get poetic. On me, Mr. Dinar. I'm not a symbol. I'm just trying to fix what's broken." Rick smiled. That's exactly why I trust you." In the weeks that followed, Mary prepared for the high-stakes presentation like everything depended on it because it did. She studied blueprints, ran simulations, built test protocols late into the night. Rick saw more dedication in her than he'd seen in any Ivy League consultant. The two of them started spending long hours in the war room, not just working, but talking about their pasts, their regrets, what they lost. Rick spoke of his time in combat, the guilt of orders given, and friends buried. Mary spoke of her husband, a steelworker who died young, and the years she spent scraping dignity. From jobs no one else wanted, there was no pity between them, only mutual recognition of scars. The symposium in Chicago arrived like a storm. It was held in a glass convention center surrounded by tight security, packed with government contractors, military brass, and tech. CEOs, Rick wore his usual tailored suit, but Mary walked in with her simple blouse and slacks, hair tied back, a worn brown notebook under her arm. She looked nothing like the polished faces on stage, but when she spoke, the room fell quiet. Her demonstration used no buzzwords. She built a live simulation of an attack and walked the audience through how a reversed data flow could mask malicious access points. Her voice was steady, her logic crystal clear. She even cracked a joke midway dry, unexpected, and perfectly timed. The panel, at first skeptical, leaned forward. By the time Rick closed with a short, heartfelt remark about vigilance and humility in innovation, the crowd was already nodding. Within 48 hours, Patriot Corps received a confirmation email. The government had awarded them a defense contract worth over $250 billion, but victory came with exposure. Word spread quickly. A former janitor now credited with saving a top-tier security firm. The media pounced. Headlines ranged from celebratory to mocking. The maid who outsmarted the hackers, Cinderella in cyberspace. Some praised her, others ridiculed her. Overnight, Mary became a national story. Late-night comedians used her image as a punchline. Internet trolls unearthed personal details: her modest home, her old job cleaning hospital floors, even photos of her grandson. The scrutiny became relentless. Then came the op-eds. Was Patriot Corps lowering standards? Was Rick Danner promoting sympathy hires? One columnist accused Mary of being a plantain actress staged by the company as a publicity stunt. Rick tried to manage the firestorm, but his legal team advised caution. His board demanded he issue a statement distancing the company from her unauthorized actions. Investors threatened to pull back. For the first time, Rick hesitated. He didn't denounce her, but he didn't defend her either. He released a vague statement praising team contributions and the collective efforts of all staff. Mary read it twice, then once more. No mention of her name, no credit, no courage. That night, Rick found her in the lab, quietly cleaning her desk. "You don't have to do this," he said. "They'll move on. The media cycles fast." Mary looked at him, not with anger, but with deep disappointment. "You stood by me when no one else would, and when it really counted you blinked." Rick's jaw tightened. "I was trying to protect the company." Mary nodded slowly. "And I'm trying to protect something to my dignity. That's all I've got. I won't be your controversy." She handed him her access badge. "I'm leaving. Not because I'm angry, but because this place doesn't know how to carry the truth, and I'm tired of carrying it alone." He watched her walk away. No theatrics, no us. Just a quiet exit, like thousands she'd made before. But this one broke something in him. Not just guilt-shame, because in that moment, Rick Danner realized he'd betrayed not just her, but everything he claimed to stand for. And it would cost him more than he knew. The departure of Mary Collins left more than just a vacant desk. It triggered a chain reaction that ripped through Patriot Corps systems like a slow-burning fuse. The first sign of collapse was subtle: system latency during routine defense simulations. Then its spread. Internal patches began conflicting with legacy firewalls. Server clusters misfired, and one by one, the redundant safeguards Mary had proposed and maintained began to erode. Within 10 days, 2 federal contracts were suspended. Due to security compliance failures, the boardroom that had once echoed with corporate pride was now a cage of blame and silence. Rick Danner sat at the head of the table, every report in front of him a monument to the decision he regretted most. Not just letting Mary leave, but not standing up for her when it mattered. The media hadn't moved on as promised. Instead, the backlash deepened. Online voices turned vicious, investors grew nervous, and Patriot Core stock plunged nearly 12% in less than a month. Executives scrambled to contain the fallout, spinning talking points and forming committees, but nothing stuck. The story was already public. The only person who could hold the system together had been dismissed, not because she failed, but because she didn't fit. And the system was now reminding everyone how fragile it truly was. Rick tried to move forward, tried to operate on autopilot. He showed up to meetings, signed off on reports, made calls to Washington, but his heart wasn't in it. Every hallway echoed with a silence he couldn't name. Every terminal he passed reminded him of the calm, confident way Mary would lean in. Analyze, correct not with arrogance, but with clarity. And every night he found himself haunted by a single question. Why hadn't he fought harder for her? Then came the Senate hearing. An emergency session was called to review federal tech partnerships after multiple breaches, two of which had originated from Patriot Core's now exposed systems. Rick was summoned to testify under oath. The room was colder than he remembered. From his military debriefs, lined with cameras and skepticism, the lead senator, a sharp-tongued former prosecutor named Elaine Cartwright, didn't waste time. "Mr. Danner, you told this country your company was the last firewall protecting national digital infrastructure. And now you're sitting before us with a track record of internal failures, mismanagement, and the quiet exit of the very consultant who helped you secure those contracts. What happened?" Rick gave rehearsed answers, spoke of complexity, evolving threats, human error, but his voice lacked conviction. The truth was, he no longer believed the words himself. When the hearing adjourned, he sat alone in the empty chamber. Long after the senators had left in the shadows, he admitted he had failed. Not just as a leader, but as a man who had once believed in honor above profit. That night, Rick went to her house. No limo, no assistant, no statement, just him. In his truck parked outside the modest home she shared with her grandson. He knocked gently. Mary opened the door halfway, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Her face was tired, but not angry. Rick finally said, "I'm not here to ask you to come back. I know I don't deserve that. I just wanted to tell you. I was wrong. I saw the storm coming, and I flinched. You stood taller than anyone I've known, and I shrank." Mary didn't reply right away. Then she stepped outside, closed the door gently behind her, and walked with him to the porch. They sat in silence for several minutes, the kind of silence only two people who have lived through regret can share. Finally, she spoke. "You didn't just let me down, you let them win. The ones who never believed I belonged. And when you had the microphone, you handed it over to their fear." Rick nodded, eyes wet. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness." Mary looked up at the stars. "Forgiveness isn't the issue. I forgive you. But forgetting, that takes time." She went inside, and Rick drove off. Not angry, not defeated, but aware. Fully aware that redemption wouldn't come from a speech or a fix. It would have to be earned, and not in boardrooms, but in acts that no one applauded. He returned to the office with a new intensity, not the old fire of ambition, but a humbler sense of purpose. He started auditing every policy Mary had once touched. He pushed back on the board, reinstated security protocols she had designed, and began restructuring the team, starting with Carl Mendel, who was suspended from manipulation of internal logs. Rick found out Carl had delayed critical updates to discredit Mary's work. The scandal went public. Shareholders were furious. Carl was eventually indicted for negligence and conspiracy. The company was bleeding, but slowly stabilizing. Rick spent his days rebuilding, his nights revisiting every corner of the firm Mary had ever improved. He thought about her often, not in fantasy, but in reverence. And quietly, in his own way, he began speaking about her again, in interviews, behind closed doors, in tech panels. He credited her openly. He corrected the story. And while some outlets dismissed it as damage control, others began to listen. But Mary remained distant. She returned to her quiet life, focusing on her grandson, declining all interview requests, and rejecting every tech firm that tried to recruit her with six-figure offers. When a journalist asked her why, she simply said, "Because some things you do with your hands." Others you do with your soul. And I'm not selling mine. Back at Patriot Core, the air began to change. Engineers whispered about Collins' protocols as a benchmark. Rick's leadership shifted, less commanding, more listening. When he was invited to speak at the National Security Forum again, he hesitated. Not because he feared failure, but because he knew the story wasn't his to tell alone. Still, he accepted. Not to reclaim his pride, but to face what needed to be said out loud to everyone who had watched him fail in silence. And Mary, watching the news from her living room, saw the announcement. She didn't pick up the phone. She didn't make a plan. But something inside her stirred, not out of nostalgia or vindication, but because the world was shifting again, and whether she liked it or not, she had become part of that shift. The morning of the National Security Forum arrived like a summons from fate. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation, packed with military officials, tech pioneers, and journalists eager to witness Patriot Core redemption or its final unraveling. Rick Danner paced backstage, notes in hand, heart racing. He had faced combat, closed billion-dollar deals, and stood before Congress. But nothing weighed heavier than this moment. He wasn't afraid of failure. He had already failed. What frightened him now was the silence of truth, the kind that crushed people like Mary Collins, and how long it had taken him to find the courage to speak it out loud. The script in his hand felt useless. Words written by PR specialists couldn't capture what needed to be said. And worse, he wasn't sure he could say it without her outside. Across the city, Mary watched the event on her modest television, the volume low, her grandson playing on the floor nearby. She hadn't planned to watch, but something in her gut told her this wasn't just another speech. As Rick's name was announced, the camera panned to the stage. He approached the podium slowly, eyes fixed ahead, every step a confrontation with the man he used to be. The applause was polite but restrained. No one had forgotten the company's recent failures. He adjusted the microphone, looked down at his notes, then froze. His hand trembled. The words blurred. The auditorium, filled with the sharpest minds in national defense, waited in tense silence. For a long moment, Rick said nothing. Then he exhaled, set the notes aside, and looked directly into the crowd. I came here to talk about firewalls, about defense networks, about our technology, but I can't do that in good conscience without telling you the truth first. The room shifted, phones stopped recording. People began to listen. Rick continued, his voice firm now. This company survived a cyber attack that should have broken us. Not because of our systems, not because of me, but because of a woman whom most of this industry would have ignored. Mary Collins. She was not a consultant, not a developer, not part of our executive team. She was our janitor, and she was the only one who saw what none of us could. Mary's eyes welled as she leaned closer to the screen. Rick's words rang clear, unflinching. I didn't protect her when it mattered. I let fear of public perception silence me. And because of that, we lost her. We lost our compass. And I lost a chance to honor someone who deserved far more than I ever gave her. The audience, once skeptical, was silent. Rick's voice cracked. I'm not asking for applause. I'm not asking for a second chance. I'm just telling the truth because I should have told it a long time ago. And then, without warning, a quiet murmur rippled through the back of the hall. Heads turned. There, walking down the aisle, was Mary. She wore the same modest clothes she always did. No entourage, no fanfare. Just a calm woman stepping into a storm she had already weathered once before. Security moved, but someone waved them off. She walked up the steps to the stage, approached Rick, and leaned in close enough that only he could hear her. Say it like you would have said it to your father, she whispered. The man who taught you what truth was supposed to sound like. Rick blinked hard, steadied himself, then turned back to the microphone. I was raised to believe that a man's value is measured not by his victories, but by how he treats the people who help him get there. I forgot that, she reminded me, and I will spend the rest of my days making sure her name is never forgotten. The crowd erupted not in a roar, but in a long, rising wave of respect. Mary didn't smile. She simply nodded once, then stepped back. Rick didn't try to stop her. He knew the moment belonged to her, not him. Afterward, reporters swarmed. Questions flew. Mary said nothing, but her presence said enough. Rick canceled his next engagements, walked her to the private car waiting outside. And for the first time in weeks, there was peace between them. In the days that followed, Patriot Core saw a strange phenomenon. Public trust began to rebound, not because of spin, but because people recognized humility. Articles rewrote the narrative. The woman who saved the system became a new headline. Mary received invitations from tech schools, government think tanks, and even a request from the president's office for a private recognition ceremony. She declined most of them. What mattered to her wasn't the applause, it was justice. And justice came when Rick formally established the Mary Collins Institute for Adult Technical Advancement, funded with a portion of his own shares. The board protested. He didn't blink. He had built the company once. He would rebuild it with new principles or not at all. Meanwhile, Carl Mendel faced indictment not just for negligence, but for deliberate sabotage. Evidence surfaced that he had suppressed patches Mary recommended and tampered with performance reports to undermine her credibility. His downfall was public, brutal, and long overdue. Mary received a formal apology letter from the Department of Defense. She folded it once, placed it in her drawer, and never mentioned it again. Her life returned to its quiet rhythm. Gardening, cooking, helping her grandson with schoolwork. But something had changed. She was no longer invisible, and she was no longer alone. One afternoon, Rick showed up unannounced at her door. Not with flowers, not with speeches, just a small box in hand and a nervous look in his eyes. Inside the box were two things: the original company patch from the first server Mary had fixed, and a key. "To the house I grew up in," he said. "It's empty now. I want it to be yours. If you'll let me come with it." Mary took the box, didn't answer right away, then simply said, "Let's walk. I'll think about it." And as they walked slowly toward the horizon, neighbors watching through curtains, reporters finally giving up on stories too human to trend. A new chapter began, not because it was scripted, but because two people had decided that truth, once spoken, had to be lived. 6 months had passed since the forum, and Patriot Core Systems had been reborn through fire and truth. The company no longer operated under the illusion of perfection. Rick had restructured the leadership team, eliminated the dead weight, and brought in a new generation of talent, most from unconventional paths, all vetted for character before credentials. The Mary Collins Institute had launched quietly but powerfully. Tech programs. Scholarships poured in. Letters arrived daily. Some were from veterans, others from former factory workers, all echoing the same hope. "It's not too late for me." Chances. Mary watched it all unfold from a quiet distance. She had accepted Rick's keynote to the house, but to the idea of a future shared without illusions. They spent weekends together, not as lovers yet, but as companions healing from separate wounds. Sometimes they spoke of what might be, sometimes they sat in silence, letting the weight of old years pass without needing to explain them. Rick didn't push. He understood now that trust wasn't granted once and held forever, had to be earned again, daily, with humility. But peace, however well-earned, never lasts long in stories that matter. The crisis came not with an alarm, but with a whisper. A whistleblower from inside a defense contractor flagged a hidden exploit buried deep in a data-sharing protocol co-authored by Patriot Core 2 years prior. The flaw had gone unnoticed until a foreign entity attempted to exploit it through an allied satellite network. The breach failed, but barely. Government officials moved quickly, demanding answers. Investigations began. Every scar, and this time, the problem wasn't just reputational. Lives were potentially at risk. Rick called an emergency summit. As he entered the war room, now updated, modernized, staffed by people who had once felt excluded, he carried none of the old bravado. "This is our fault," he said, before anyone could speak. "It was built on our watch, and we're not blaming this on legacy code. We own it." But despite their best efforts, the exploit's root pattern remained elusive. It mimicked a signature buried in one of the modules Mary had once flagged, but hadn't been allowed to revise fully due to... He drove to her house that evening, this time not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as a leader asking for help. Mary greeted him with a knowing look. "I figured you'd show up eventually," she said, setting down a dish towel. He handed her the diagnostic reports. "I need your eyes on this. I know it's not your job anymore, But if this pattern spreads, people could die. This isn't just a coding flaw, she said. This is a design failure. Someone hid this on purpose. Rick's chest tightened. You mean sabotage? Mary nodded. Not from us, but someone who had access, someone high up, possibly from one of our former partner firms. If what Mary suspected was true, Patriot Core had unknowingly been the delivery system for a near-catastrophic breach engineered by someone pretending to be an ally. Within days, the theory was confirmed. Digital forensics traced the exploit's origin to an encrypted submission approved by a now-defunct vendor that had once been backed by Carl Mendel's private fund. The connection was tenuous, but enough to alert federal authorities. The Department of Justice got involved. A grand jury was convened. Mary, once mocked as a janitor, now sat in classified briefings, explaining to national security directors how the attack had almost succeeded because the industry had prioritized speed over scrutiny. The crisis passed. 1. Military communications. Project was shelved. A diplomatic incident flared briefly with an allied nation before quiet, back-channel resolutions were reached. Patriot Core faced a second round of hearings, this time as part hero, part cautionary tale. But when Rick testified, he brought Mary with him, seated beside him, not in the back, not as a symbol, but as the co-lead of their investigation. Cameras captured the moment. The woman once ignored now nodded quietly as senators quoted her technical notes as gospel. Public trust surged. But Rick wasn't watching the polls. He was watching her every step of the way, understanding that the future of his company and of his soul rested on whether or not he could finally build something not just brilliant, but worthy. At the end of that turbulent quarter, as Patriot Core stabilized once more, Rick made one final decision that silenced every remaining critic. He stepped down as CEO, not in disgrace, but in design. He named Mary as chair of the board, a role she accepted only after weeks of quiet reflection. "I'm not running a company," she said. "I'm setting its compass." Every protocol had to be open reviewed by 3 independent teams, and no hire, at any level, could proceed without a character interview by someone who had once worked a job below the executive level. Rick stayed on as consultant. His final gesture was private ring, small, elegant, offered on a morning when the world wasn't watching. Mary didn't answer right away. Instead, she took his hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "Let's finish what we started first, then we'll talk about beginnings." The storm had passed, but the air around Patriot Core still hummed with the aftershocks of transformation. Under Mary's leadership as chair, the company didn't just operate differently, felt different, and ego were now grounded in clear goals and shared values. Staff spoke with honesty, even if it risked disagreement. And most importantly, the walls of hierarchy that had once silenced voices like Mary's were dismantled from the inside. Yet, despite the company's rebirth, one final test remained, an opportunity to close the circle not with a technical triumph, but with a moral one. Attendees, but as keynote speakers to open the forum. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on them. It wasn't about technology anymore. It was about standing in full view of the nation and speaking a truth that had once nearly been buried. The day before the summit, Mary sat alone on the porch of the old farmhouse Rick had given her. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that didn't threaten rain but held something quieter. She read over her notes, then set them aside. She didn't need them. The truth had never been something she rehearsed, it was something she lived. Rick joined her with 2 mugs of coffee and silence between them. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Next morning, the East Wing buzzed with dignitaries, tech giants, and military advisors. Journalists crowded every hallway. Mary, dressed in her usual simple attire, gray slacks and a cream blouse, walked beside Rick past layers of security. She refused makeup teams, ignored stylists, and declined any prepared speech from communications officers. Navy suit had also shed any pretense. He no longer played the part of the tech mogul. He had become the man he wished he'd been at the start. As they took the stage, the room fell into a rare, total silence. Rick spoke first, with brevity. "A few years ago, I thought security meant control. Today, I know it means trust. And there's no one I trust more to speak on that than the woman who taught me what it really costs to protect what matters." He stepped aside. Mary took the podium, her hand steady, eyes calm, her voice low but unwavering. For years, I cleaned the halls of companies like this one. And I listened. I watched, and what I saw was a system that confused silence with safety, credentials with character. She let that sit in the air, unchallenged, then continued. Security isn't about firewalls or encryption keys. It's about who's watching the gate. And if the only people you trust are the ones who look like they belong, you've already lost. The crowd remained motionless. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. I was given a mop, not a mic, but I knew systems. I knew logic. I knew what I saw was broken, and I fixed it not because it was my job, but because I could. A few heads nodded. Others leaned forward. Mary's tone never changed, and when it came time to be recognized, I wasn't. Not at first, but someone listened, and that's all it takes sometimes. One person to stop doubting what's unfamiliar. One person to say, "I see you." She paused, then added, "Now I say it back to every invisible worker, every overlooked voice. You don't need permission to know the truth. You just need the courage to act on it." The applause came in waves, not the polite kind, but the rare thunder of an audience moved beyond words. Military generals stood. Cabinet members clapped. Journalists rushed to capture every line. Mary didn't wait for it to end. Mattered outside, Rick caught up with her beneath the colonnade. "You broke them," he said with a half-smile. Mary shrugged. "I didn't break anything." That night, the nation heard her voice replayed across every network. Anchors didn't spin it. They quoted her directly. The president issued a personal commendation. And most stunningly, the Department of Labor announced a national initiative to create tech scholarships for adults over 50. But Mary didn't chase cameras. She declined interviews and returned home with Rick in silence. That evening, as they stood under the stars, Rick took her hand. "You don't have to say yes, but I'd be a fool not to ask again." The same small box, the ring inside, unchanged. But everything around it had changed. Mary looked at it, then at him. "You're not the same man who asked the first time," she said quietly, "and I'm not the woman who had to say, 'Not yet.'" She took the ring. But only they knew how much it had cost. It was early spring when the last pieces fell quietly into place. The air at the farm was thick with the scent of rain-soaked soil and the distant hum of planting machines beyond the hills. The farmhouse Rick had once offered Mary now stood weathered, but steady, with wind chimes at the porch and fresh herbs growing in neat rows beside the stone path. Inside, the silence wasn't empty, it was full of motion. A kettle whistling faintly, an old radio murmuring jazz in the background, the soft laughter of a boy reading aloud from a school book. In the living room, Rick sat at the edge of a worn sofa, glasses balanced low on his nose, a Bible open in his hands, not for performance, not even for comfort, but for rhythm, a kind of grounding in something older than answers. Mary stood by the window, folding laundry slowly, a half-finished letter to a former colleague left on the table. She hadn't meant to stop mid-sentence. Her hands had just begun moving and didn't want to stop. Through the glass, she could see her grandson playing in the yard, his jacket tied at the waist, chasing after the neighbor's dog with unfiltered joy. The boy had started speaking more in recent months, laughing louder, sleeping deeper. She noticed it not all at once, but in flashes, how he lingered longer at the dinner table, how he no longer jumped at thunder, how he now asked questions with curiosity, not caution. There were still shadows, but they no longer defined him. Healing, she'd learned, wasn't a thing you declared. It was something you noticed too late to name. Down in Arlington, Patriot Corps continued to operate. Quieter now, more careful. The headquarters had a new Winkum Pact, not flashy named in honor of overlooked pioneers in technology. There were no busts, no golden plaques, just a row of clean desks and a single glass wall inscribed with lines of code Mary had once scribbled on a napkin during a late-night call. Rick visited twice a week, stayed for meetings, but rarely lingered. He knew what it meant to let go with dignity. The new CEO, a former systems engineer who once repaired servers in a basement, ran the company with a kind of deliberate humility that made the staff stand taller. There were no chants about legacy, no slogans about excellence, but performance. Metrics improved, staff retention doubled, shareholders stopped asking about PR campaigns and started asking how they could help expand the institute. The Mary Collins Institute had by then enrolled over 1,000 students. Most were over 50, some retired, some laid off, others simply starting over because life had demanded it. Instructors didn't use slides, they used real code, real problems, real respect. The only requirement for admission was a willingness to learn and a life lived long enough to know how precious that chance was. Mary refused to give speeches at graduations. She preferred to stand in the back, sometimes alone, watching men and women cross the stage with trembling hands, gripping diplomas as if they were lifelines. She always left before the applause that spring. Rick and Mary were married in a small ceremony beneath the willow tree near the back field. There were no photographers, no choreographed dances, no speeches. Her grandson read a short verse, too softly for the guests to hear clearly, but with conviction. Rick wore a dark gray suit with a boutonniere Mary had pinned on herself. That morning, she wore a pale blue dress and a simple chain around her neck with a copper kitha one he had given her years before. Not a symbol anymore, just a thing that had once opened a door. They exchanged vows with few words. Their eyes said the rest. After the ceremony, they didn't throw a reception. Instead, they invited the few who came from our colleagues, to neighbors, her grandson's teacher, into the house for soup and bread and old stories. No one filmed it, nothing went viral. Later that night, after everyone had gone, they sat on the porch again, just as they had so many evenings before, the wind calm, the stars reluctant to show themselves. Rick reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. They didn't speak of the past or of legacy or of what had been lost. They simply sat until the silence turned familiar again. Weeks later, in the quiet hours before dawn, Mary woke early. Unable to sleep, she walked barefoot across the kitchen, made tea, and stepped out onto the porch. The fields were still dark, the horizon just beginning to stretch itself awake. She watched the slow unfolding of light across the land, not dramatic, not sudden, but soft, inevitable. She thought of everything that had happened not as a timeline, but as texture. A pattern she could feel beneath her skin but couldn't fully explain. Somewhere behind her, Rick stirred. The floor creaked. A kettle clinked. The world, imperfect and unfinished, kept going. There would be no final applause, no clear line drawn under the story, just the hum of life carrying forward. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the breeze move across her face. There was still work to do, papers to review, a grant proposal to finish, a child to raise. But for now, for this breath of time, all was still, all was whole. It's sad.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.